Welcome to Navigating India. This episode is released on March 22nd, 2026, and exactly 6 years ago, on March 22nd, 2020, India observed the Janata Curfew, an initiative by the government to combat COVID. But it did not stop the pandemic, and everyone is directly or indirectly affected by the COVID, and everyone has a COVID story to tell. Our guest today, journalist Jyoti Yadav, was then working with the print. Instead of shutting herself in at home, she set out from Delhi to the rural areas of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar to cover the pandemic on the ground, and she did the same again when the second wave hit. She traveled in harsh conditions and reported the hardships faced by migrant workers, the shortage of oxygen cylinders, the underreporting of COVID cases, the undercounting of COVID deaths, children orphaned by the pandemic, dreams shattered, and the collapse of states' health infrastructure. Along her way, she interviewed hundreds of people on the road: migrants, administrators, healthcare, frontline workers, and communities of people who were burning corpses with no safety measures. Based on her ground zero journalism, she has now written a book called Faith and Fury: COVID Dispatches from India's Hinterlands. This book is an important documentation of India's pandemic years, and it raises serious questions that demand to be heard. Let's hear from her about the book and her experiences reporting on COVID. We have actually recorded this episode twice to be more precise about telling the COVID story. Jyoti Yadav, thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to begin by pointing out two things. Firstly, the two words in the title of your book, Faith and Fury, essentially capture the emotions everyone was grappling with during the COVID crisis. And secondly, during COVID, what most of us knew were the numbers: daily case counts, recoveries, and deaths. But there were very few stories about what was actually happening in rural India until the migrant crisis forced it to the spotlight. Now, even then, our understanding of COVID remained very limited. You traveled extensively in rural India, especially Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and produced important reportage. So tell us about the title and also why this book now, years later, when everyone seems to be trying to leave their COVID memories behind, and the media has effectively written, quote, COVID off to death, stop quote.
Thank you, Rishwant, for having me. And this is the second time we are recording, just for the record. But thank you for doing this, and thank you for redoing this. The first question, Faith and Fury, the title. So, when we were deciding the title, we were thinking of many names, and my editor at the print then, Rama Lakshmi, with whom I worked for 5 years, 6 years, she came up with this title, Faith and Fury. And as you rightly said, that all the characters in the book, they are grappling with these two emotions. And once you finish reading the book, you come out with strongly these emotions strongly dominate your reading. So Faith and Fury, because no matter how much there was rage and anger and fury, there was also faith. So we wanted to capture these two emotions, and there could not have been a better title than this. But we had to bring COVID in the subtitle, because anyone looking at the cover, they need to know what kind of a book they are going to read. So we brought COVID in the subtitle, and we completely rejected COVID in the headline. And also, as we all uh, noticed, that every time a news article which had COVID as a keyword, there was a tendency among us as journalists and also among the readers to escape that news. So, and because there is a fatigue, there is a forced forgetting about COVID, whatever it is, but there is a tendency to forget the memories, to put the past behind and move on in life. So the book is coming out after 6 years of the first COVID wave and the 5 years after the second COVID wave. So we tried to capture these emotions while not mentioning or highlighting COVID in the title. To respond to your second question, why now? So this is what I mentioned during the launch of the book, that when we move further in our lives, when we move further from COVID, 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years later, we will have memories of what dominated the headlines. So maybe cinema shut, maybe our lives disrupted, maybe we were doing the dishes, maybe we picked up the guitar, we were writing some books, we were doing lots of things, we were learning, unlearning things in the lockdown. But the stories of the subaltern India, the ones who struggled a lot, who had to endure the worst kind of crisis in their lives, the migrants, the cycle girl, the orphan kids, the ones who didn't get a hospital bed or an oxygen cylinder. So we really need to put faces to the statistics, and it was time that we give permanence to those stories, and permanence in the form of a book and not just in news articles on digital media. So I believe, and even my editor at Westland, she believed that even after 5 years of COVID or 6 years of the first lockdown, this book is still relevant and people are going to read it. So we had our faith in this book.
In your response, you have just mentioned about the cycle girl of Bihar, who is actually Jyoti Kumari. You both share the first name. And the stories of people like Jyoti Kumari and other migrants going back from the cities to their villages is what have shown the severity of the COVID crisis during the first wave. Can you tell us a story of Jyoti Kumari?
Yes. So we came to know about Jyoti Kumari when a viral video was all over Twitter and Instagram, and everybody was hailing her as a hero, and someone was calling her a beautiful feat of endurance, and even Ivanka Trump tweeted about her, calling her brave, etc. So I didn't break her story, but I did a follow up on her story. So she lived some 20 kilometers away from Darbhanga. It is at the center of Mithilanchal in Bihar. And when I reached out to her, I was interested in why she had to, first take that, why did she have to start traveling when everything was shut, and she had to also carry her ailing father. He was having some troubles with his legs and he was already sick. So I was interested in the story of her migration as well. So I got to know that her father was a migrant. He moved to Gurugram in 1990s, and then he started working. And that year, in 2020, when he fell sick, Jyoti moved to care for his father, and soon there was a lockdown, and the landlords, they started demanding rent from her. Then they started demanding that they must vacate the room that they had rented. So Jyoti had to take that extreme step of leaving the roof over their head in a crisis like that and start her journey home. So she only had the cycle and some money in her Jan Dhan account, and she left. And she also carried her father all along. But her sister and Jyoti, uh, they revealed the details of what they witnessed on the roads. They said, we are the lucky ones. There were people who didn't even get a cycle. There were people who didn't even have a truck ride. They were walking barefoot, and they had their miseries, they never made it to the media. But her story didn't end when she reached home, when she was hailed as a hero, when some filmmaker reached out to her to make a film on her life journey. Her story of invisibility. When I'm using the word invisibility because they remain invisible to the mainstream media and the mainstream world. So she was a hero, she got some fame, she got the visibility, but once the media's last camera left her home, the invisibility returned to her. So the film that was supposed to be to get released, it was never released, and she got the money, but she could never complete the higher education which she dreamt of. She dreamt of going to college, becoming something, but her story, you know, the story of an underdog making it to the top, it was never like that. And I got to know her story after her fame, because I was following up on her story after 2022, 23, 24. So the latest I spoke to her was in 2025, and she didn't complete her education, though she managed to build a house for her family, but she could not achieve what she has originally dreamt of becoming a graduate. So that's her story, and you will read about her story in the book.
The story of one more individual that we come across very early in your book is the story of Ram Kripal. And the story of Ram Kripal is deeply devastating. Tell us his story.
So Ram Kripal, we met him when he had already died. We didn't meet him when he was alive, because I clearly remember we were in Sant Kabir Nagar. It is an adjoining district to Gorakhpur, which is on the UP and Bihar border. And it was the second week of our coverage during the first lockdown, and we were already exhausted. We were staying in a roadside hotel which was deserted. There were no other guests other than me and my colleague Bismi and the driver Manish. We were just taking a stroll in the city. In the morning, Manish and me, we decided to just, go 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 and explore what kind of stories were there. We had already been documenting the migrant crisis. We were getting on the trucks along with them. We were speaking to them. But that day, we just wanted to go and look for organic stories that were unfolding in towns like Sant Kabir Nagar. So there was a queue that lined up to the district jail. So during the first COVID wave, the district jails, the schools, they were turned into screening centers. Some were turned in quarantine centers. So this jail was turned into a screening center. A screening center was a center where the migrants who had walked from all over India to that particular district would be screened for a COVID test. So they were taking their temperatures, they were checking if they had fever or not, etc. So Ram Kripal, he was one among the thousands in that line, and he just fell out of the line. We moved ahead thinking that uh, maybe he just wanted to break the line and he could not stand longer there. But we moved ahead, we visited the center, and while we were returning, we saw that he was not there. So we checked with other migrants who had lined up there, and they told me that he was taken to the hospital. So we asked them, why was he taken to the hospital? They said he fell and he was unconscious, and some policemen came and they took him to the hospital. So then our journey started. We started tracing his last rites. So we discovered that he had died, and there was a post-mortem report, and the last rites performed by the district administration. So we traced his journey from that line to the crematorium. So his story again, the story of Ram Kripal lies in the way he died and after he died. So the district administration, they took his body to the cremation ground, and they called upon two domes. I just wanted to clarify that domes are placed at the bottom of caste hierarchy, and they are supposed to cremate the dead, and that's how the dome word came into existence. So they are defined by this caste name. Two domes were there. So his family, Ram Kripal's family, was brought into a tractor. His wife, his sons, and his relatives, they were all put together into that tractor, and they were brought at the ghat. And we were also following the ambulance and the district administration vehicles that were escorting the dead body. There was a dead body. There were 3 to 4 vehicles of district administration. They were escorting the dead body, and there was this crowd of one side. At one side was a family, grieving family, other side the district administration, and on the third side Bismi and Manish, uh, and we were there as a team. So here, uh, the district administration, there were three top officials of block level, and there were only 4 to 5 PPE kits available. And if you remember, during the first lockdown, there was a shortage of PPE kits, masks, and other equipments. So the administrators, they decided to wear the PPE kits themselves, leaving the grieving woman, the wife, uh, at some distance. They didn't allow her to actually see the dead body. She wanted to say goodbye, final goodbye. She wanted to, touch her husband, see her husband, but they didn't allow her. They had certain norms in place. They said no, we have to follow the COVID guidelines, etc. And the domes cremated the body, and the officials wore the PPE kits, and they posed for photographs. So next day I found out that there was a front page news about them cremating a COVID patient, because by the end of the day, or the next day, the COVID test came out positive for Ram Kripal Singh. So he was a COVID patient, and his postmortem said that he had taken a pill for fever, and he was empty stomach. There was a bottle with him, and the story ended with the family, who was already at a distance. They never went near to the dead body. They were put into quarantine instead of the administrators. So they were quarantined for no reasons, and they spent some 15 days of the morning period of 14 or 13 days, according to Hindu traditions. So they were denied that dignity and respect. So that was the story of Ram Kripal.
Why were they kept in the quarantine? Because they haven't even been allowed to go near the body of their.
Right. So we asked the district magistrate. We asked him, sent him queries. We requested him that the family never went near to the dead body. So why are they quarantined? But we never received any response from them. They said, I think I got a message much later, a reply much later, that okay, we'll look into this. But the family had to spend 15 days in a quarantine center, and the quarantine centers, in popular imagination, are these fully equipped AC rooms in urban centers. The rural areas, they didn't have quarantine centers like that. They were simply schools turned into quarantine centers with one machardani, mosquito net there, and the benches put together. They worked as a makeshift bed. So that was the case with this particular story. Of course, it was heartbreaking. First, the way he died, and later, how his death was dealt with the district administration.
That is very unfortunate. I think the another important people in your story are this Dome community. As you have already mentioned, these are the low caste community who are basically involved in the corpse burning, and nobody actually talked about them, the conditions of them, or where they're given safety, and they actually played a very important role in both in the first and the second wave. And you have spoken to the Dome community in Bihar as well as in Uttar Pradesh. Can you tell us their story?
The domes. So I met them in Varanasi during the second COVID wave, and there have been some reports by some journalists about the struggles that they were facing. So I really wanted to sit down, do a deep dive, because by the time I was in Varanasi, I had already spent 2 weeks in the peak of second wave, and when the numbers were soaring high, and there was uh, absolute chaos and madness in the hospitals and crematoriums. So I wanted to chase the story of domes because I saw them wearing no PP kits. They turned their gamchas into masks. There was no safety gear with them, and yet they were cremating 30 to 35 dead bodies a day. So one body takes certain hours to be cremated, and by the time one dome was finished with one body, there would be 4 to 5 bodies lined up. Some dead bodies had their family members, loved ones, and while some didn't even have a family member, because due to stigma, fear, some families abandoned the patients in hospitals, and the hospitals then reached out to the district officials and asking for help. So, what to do with these dead bodies? The domes then volunteered to not just become the priest, because at the ghat there were no priests, so there were no sacred chants being recited by the priests. There was normal rituals being followed. The domes, they then doubled up as priest and also as a dom, so they were doing a lot during that phase. But in our popular imagination, or in the media narrative, the heroes were doctors. Of course they were heroes of COVID times. The nurses, the police officials, the bureaucrats, they were made out to be heroes of the COVID years. But the domes, I think they somehow became a footnote in the history. So we really need to know what did they endure during the second COVID wave, and what kind of compensations or they received for the services that they provided. And it was a selfless service at that moment, because if a family has abandoned somebody and they had uh, volunteered to say the goodbye, because dignity in death was also stripped away during the second COVID wave. So first the bodies were wrapped in plastic, then they were not allowed, because they were strict COVID norms that you can't unwrap the body and uh, say the goodbye to your loved one. So the dignity in death was also taken away by COVID norms. So, in that sense, the domes were really doing a great service for the society, and I think that they were not given the credit that they deserved. So, I really wanted to speak to them. But also, when I say that they didn't have a single window during the entire daytime or the night time, that I could sit down with some of them and report on how their days or nights looked like, because they had no time to sit down only. So they would have time by the midnight, by 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, when they had some time for themselves, because their duty would start early in the morning. There were long queues of dead bodies that were arriving at the ghats. So in my book you read this in details, but there will not be uh, one particular singular standalone piece on them, because they didn't have time to be documented. So you can imagine the magnitude of the crisis from their lens.
I mean, exactly. The magnitude of the COVID deaths, especially, is very large, and we also have now a clear evidence of it being underreported. I think that's what I want to talk about next, which is in one of your chapters. I think you are suspecting that the amount of deaths that were being actually reported is much lesser than how many people are actually dying and being cremated. And when you say this to your editor, DK Singh, you point out that your editor said, and I quote, "Go and count the dead bodies, the bodies won't lie." So, can you tell us about the huge underreporting of deaths that was happening during COVID?
Right. Yes, Reshwant, and the undercounting of deaths is a narrative that has dominated the COVID years. And when we talk about the gaps in the counting of the dead, so we refer to the statistics provided by the state, and the statistics that, as reporters, ground reporters, we witnessed on the ground. So there was a gap, and our initial reports also flagged the gaps. I was in Lucknow, and I was visiting the major crematoriums, Hindu crematoriums, then the Muslim graveyards. So I was counting dead bodies. I was at the ghats because there was no other way we could flag this gap uh, other than being there, being on the ground and counting the dead. How would you flag statistics if they are not being recorded in the registers and they are not being flashed on the health bulletins? So that was the only way to do that, to count the dead bodies and to flag the real gaps. So yes, my editor clearly asked me to do that, and it was uh, initially I was taken back because firstly I had never been to crematoriums. I had never uh, seen the last rites. I did witness it in the first COVID wave, the first lockdown, but my entire life I had never been to crematoriums. And as a reporter, and see, death of anybody is a very very terrifying experience. It can take a toll on your mental health, especially when you are young and you see young people dying. But ultimately I took that step. I went outside, I stood there, I counted the dead bodies, and then we checked the registers at the crematoriums. So they were registering the numbers, but those numbers were being filtered, and by the health officials they were filtering between COVID and non COVID, but there was no mechanism at that moment which could, other than a hospital certificate that this person was COVID positive. There were no mechanisms to actually collect the accurate data. So why there were gaps, I don't know if anyone has flagged this, but there were gaps because there were patients who never reached hospitals. There were patients whose testing results came much later, when they had already passed away, when they were already cremated. So their testing results came much later. So the testing labs or the government officials, they never corroborated with the families if their patient survived or died, because nobody had the time to double check that. So only those who had died in the hospital, only who had COVID positive result and died in the hospital, they were considered COVID death, and they were cremated in a separate crematorium. There was a separate section within the crematoriums. So this was the first instance where I could actually witness that how these gaps were engineered by the policy loopholes.
No, I mean, go for further talking about this thing. I think one story about the underreporting, which I have come across first only through your book, was that how the doctors, the nurses, and the frontline workers were not even testing themselves during the COVID time. And I think that was really shocking story to me. Can you tell us about that?
That was for me, when I was speaking to the frontline health workers, I was so moved by their accounts. But initially, if you remember, initially when there was a stigma in the society, when people were not coming forward to get tested, these frontline line health workers, they came forward. They said, okay, we will get the tests done, and then you also get tested. So firstly they volunteered they wanted to end the stigma by volunteering as you know uh, 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 as I don't know how to put this, but they just wanted to showcase and tell our citizens that it is okay to get tested. A test is itself not a death warrant. You will not get COVID just because of the test. So initially, that was the stigma around the virus. But during April, that was the peak of second COVID wave, when the positive cases were rising, soaring, and also deaths were being reported in thousands every day in districts, in big capitals. So around that time most people were infected. That's what a doctor in Hind hospital told me, that if I have 20 people, 30 people working in this COVID ward boys, nurses, other doctors, if we start testing everybody, chances are that maybe 80 or 90% of them will turn out to be COVID positives. So can we afford to lose these hands, these helping hands? So he said that we have decided not to test at all, because if we test and the results are positive, this will also bring our morale down. So instead, many frontline health workers during the month of April, when that was the second wave's peak, that around that time health workers decided not to test them for virus. And it was so, I think, as a human being, as a journalist, firstly it was brave. Secondly, one can argue that what if they didn't get themselves tested, they might have passed on the virus to somebody else. That is another argument. That was also a real risk. But the doctors, they said they were wearing ppe kits, they were protecting the virus from spreading to another patient, and mostly they were dealing with the COVID patients. So the real risk, they said, was their family members, because ultimately when you go back home, you meet your children, your old age parents, your wife, your partner. So the risk is to pass the virus to those who didn't have COVID. So some of the doctors started living separately from their families. Some officials who were dealing with the public, they were out in the public, they started living separately. You will find this Lucknow commissioner whose wife was pregnant at that moment, so he had to camp out of some other office. So that was the measure that they were taking at that time.
I mean, there's certainly a story of a great sacrifice. But I think one more story that was very visible during the COVID second wave is especially the crisis that came with the oxygen cylinders. People were dying because they could not get an oxygen cylinder. We have been seeing oxygen cylinders being stolen. And we also have this vibrant images of militarymen being deployed within the Indian inland to immediately start an oxygen cylinder plants, and they were hailed about. But we also saw a lot of deaths that happened because of the oxygen cylinder uh, mismanagement very clearly, and you wrote extensively about it. Can you elaborate it?
Yes, now we are having gas cylinder crisis, and I can vividly remember those scenes during the second COVID wave. And an oxygen cylinder back then was the most prized possession one could have. And I was in Lucknow, so I can speak about my experience of witnessing the real chaos at the ground. I I saw patients sharing their oxygen cylinder with 2 3 other patients, because there was not enough oxygen in the city. And there were hospitals who were pasting notices on their boards that we are running out of oxygen. And I think the governments, they really messed up the oxygen crisis, because they wanted to send a stringent message to the hospitals, or the ones who were hoarding the oxygen, or who were trying to profit from the crisis. So in doing that, they they ended up creating more mess. Why do I say that? Because firstly, they said the oxygen plants, they were not authorized to sell the oxygen to any patient, any attendant, any family. So the oxygen plants, which are mostly located outside the cities, at the outskirts of a city, they were being guarded by the policemen. City magistrate, or an official of a magistrate level was deployed there to guard the oxygen plant. Then the ones in the market, they were also strictly not to sell the oxygen without a letter from this authority and that authority. And in that scenario, so the ones who were in the hospital, their supply dependent on the hospital. So if a hospital gets the supply, they will get the oxygen. But those who were isolated at homes, they were dependent on the oxygen cylinders. And the families were desperate, because there were very confusing notifications from the government. And because the chaos was unfolding every single day, the government would uh, issue one rule today and then contradict the same rule tomorrow. That was happening. And during the oxygen crisis, the state courts and even the Supreme Court, they had to intervene. They had to scold the state governments to deal with the crisis and not threaten anyone or everyone with the with FIRs. And you will come across a scene in my book where a journalist who was trying to help a patient in getting an oxygen cylinder, he was booked for the for the help that he provided to one patient. So that was the case during the oxygen crisis.
I mean, that was a gross mismanagement when it comes to oxygen crisis, especially. We see families running from pillar to post to get oxygen cylinders for their aged parents, especially. And when they couldn't, they have lost their parents. And that is next news story in your book that was extremely heartbreaking, which is children losing both their parents and how they become susceptible to the drug abuse later. Can you tell us that story that you have written about?
So during the second COVID wave, so many children were orphaned. Many lost both their parents. And the story that I covered, it was in Araria, Simanchal, Bihar. And the three children, they were young, very young children, and they lost both their parents. And their father was a quack who used to sell medicines in the village, and the mother was a housewife. And both the parents, they got virus from a social gathering happening in a different village, because migrants from Surat, other parts of India, they had returned for Holi, and they had returned to these villages in UP and Bihar. They traveled, and much before the government woke up, before they enforced COVID norms, lockdown norms during the second COVID wave, much there was a large number of migrants who had already crossed the borders, who had already mingled with the rural society in UP and Bihar, and they had already brought the virus home. So this couple got virus from a social gathering, and they didn't. There was no mechanism to run testing for such a large population. So they got the virus. They were taken to some hospitals, first to a smaller hospital, then to a referral hospital. Ultimately, they died within the gap of 2-3 days. And the children, they had to bury the parents, because in our Hindu families, we cremate the dead bodies. We don't bury them, but the children, they were left alone, and the entire village, they were hell bent that if they cremate the dead body, the virus will spread to the entire village. And ironically, the village head, when I met him, when I went to the village, he was already COVID positive, and he was going on evening walks, chatting with other people. So there was a lack of knowledge among the villagers. There were more theories about the spread. There was more stigma about the virus in the village, in the rural society. So the children had to bury the dead, and they buried their parents in their own fields. They dug the graveyards themselves, and they buried the parents. So I returned to Delhi after covering this story, but I went back to the story because I knew once the social media attention has moved to some other issue, they will be left alone to deal with the loss and the emptiness, or the cluelessness in their lives. Once you lose your guardian, someone who guides you, anchors your life, so what happens to you? And similarly, in this case, as I anticipated, as I guessed, that the girls would be married off at young age, and the son would be doing some job or other. So I found some similar story in this case as well. The eldest daughter was married off. The second daughter, she was dropped out of school, and the son, who was the youngest, he was enrolled in a local clinic run by a medical practitioner. He wanted to become a quack by learning medicine for few years, by practicing in a town, and then returning to his village to become a quack, which is his father was also a quack. So that was the story of these three COVID orphans. And similar and even worse, some children were brought into trafficking. Some children were they dropped out of educational systems. So a lot happened in their lives. But the government also set up PM Care Children Fund at the central level and the state, especially Nitish Kumar government. They took some steps to rehabilitate these children and put them into back into the system of education and social welfare schemes. But there is always a fallout of these schemes, and as I witnessed in the 3 COVID orphans, they were out of the schemes very soon.
I'm pretty sure this is an ongoing story. Many people who lost their parents, or many families who lost the sole breadwinners, are still suffering the wrath of the COVID that has left behind. I mean, in your response, you have mentioned about quacks. And who are these quacks? Because in a chapter that you completely dedicated for quacks in your book, you say according to a 2018 report, there are almost 1 million quacks in India, and all 400,000 of them are operating within the Bihar itself. And people trust these people more than going to hospital. So who are these people?
So if you have grown up in a village in any state of India, you know what a quack is, what a jhola chap doctor is. They are the first contact of contact in the line of health care infrastructure. So if we live in a village, he's the first one we call in the medical emergency situation. And a large part of Indian population in rural India, they are dependent on the quacks. Sometimes they rescue us, sometimes they really mess up the cases, but that's the real scenario, that more than the AIIMS or the district hospitals or the big ones that you see in the city, they are the last resort when the patient is critical. But the first and second or the third resort are these quacks in small towns and villages. During the second COVID wave, when there were restrictions on the mobility, when you needed some travel license, so people relied on these quacks. And the quacks, of course, a quack is someone who has basic knowledge of medicine, someone who has practiced with a doctor or a hospital for some years, and he becomes a doctor himself. So they don't check degrees for them, but they check the basic knowledge. So they will prescribe Dolo for fever. They will prescribe some other medicine for let's say loose motion. So a quack was actually a lifeline during the second COVID wave. So they were touring the villages. Every second person was having cough and fever. So they could not travel to the cities, and they were hearing all kind of sad stories that if you land up in a hospital, you will come home dead. You will never make it alive. So there was this sentiment across the villages. And that was also the case if someone in critical care during the COVID wave, they didn't make it alive. So the quacks then stepped in and they helped people in healing. They prescribed these basic medicines for fever and cough, and people recovered within time. They were at home, they were resting. There was a comfort food of there was comfort food, so they recovered. And that's how majority of the villages dealt with the COVID fevers back then. But I would not glorify them, because they really messed some cases. You will see a Madhubani doctor telling me how these doctors have messed up with cases. They would prescribe normal medicines. They will keep the patient at their clinics, and once they think that they can't do beyond, they can't help the patient, then they will refer it to the patient to some hospital. And in doing that, they would really harm the patient, because the hospitals then can't do much. So that was also the case in regards to quacks.
No, again, I think this is a fault line within the Indian health infrastructure itself. And in your book, at various places, we see several gaps in the India's health infrastructure in terms of, for example, people are not able to get in the oximeters also, and which are sold at a high price. And there is black marketing when it comes to oxygen cylinders. There is sand mafia going. And there is also lack of coordination between the state and the center, and also between the district administrations, which was a gross mismanagement during the COVID-19. Now, one thing which is very visible is that despite being such severe crisis, the COVID did not become a serious election issue. You also mentioned that in your book that it hasn't turned out to be a serious election issue. What happened? Why did there was no a kind of a referendum about COVID management when it comes to election issue, which is neither highlighted by either the ruling party or the opposition parties?
Rishwan, this was a question that many people ask journalists who have covered COVID and who have traveled to rural and small town India, and especially to states like UP and Bihar. Okay, why didn't this entire COVID issue become an election issue, and why didn't the people, change the regimes? If they were so frustrated, they were so angry, upset about what happened to them in the COVID years. And I offer 2 3 explanations. I'm still looking for answers. I'm not an expert. I'm a reporter, ground reporter, and this is what I found out in my travels in the later years in UP and Bihar. So people speak about COVID, as this once a lifetime event that they survived. Those who survived, they speak about how great their immunity is, how some local deity helped them survive the crisis. And others then will talk about some women will also talked about planning second or third pregnancies because they thought if a tragedy like this to happen again, then the entire family will be wiped out. So these were the real fears. But when it comes to elections or poll elections, I could not see people coming out in large numbers or being so vocal about their anger. Of course, the families who endured unspeakable pain and the suffering, they speak about it. You will find Harshit Shrivastava, he's still angry about what happened to his father. And you will find Kalyani's husband Deepak, who ran pillar to post to secure a job for himself, and who fought with the state. He was one of the kin to the 2000 teachers who had died during the poll duty in the second COVID wave. So these are very isolated of sentiments of different survivors. But if I'm to speak about collective anger in terms of elections, I couldn't find it on the ground. And maybe some experts will explain this, and this is for others to investigate. But also, see, I also offer another explanation that since to 2020, there have been lots of global and national events, one after another, and there is hardly any break. We are all glued to our screens. We are always distracted, and this complex thing about memory and media, and I use 3 M's and machinery, the state machinery. They have all come together and somehow forced this collective forgetting of COVID on us. And people usually in their drawing room conversations, they speak about COVID. Of course it is there, but more like a tale, more like a story. So not as the way people speak against corruption, the way they speak against other injustices, they don't speak about COVID in that tone anymore. And maybe they are psychologically distancing themselves. Maybe 20-30 years later, they will be more vocal about this. But as of now, there seems to be a psychological, physical distancing from the COVID. The more we distance ourselves, the more it is comfortable for us, and we forget about what had happened.
Exactly. I think COVID seems both near and distinct at the same time. It is something that we have to do with memory, media, and the state machinery, as you have just pointed out. Jyoti, one more thing I wanted to ask is I'm sure you have come across several stories which you haven't actually reported back. given the journalistic angle, the sensitivity, or protecting the privacy of the individuals. So, are there any stories which you did not report through your print articles during the COVID and also did not find place in this book?
Yes. There were stories that didn't make it to the book, and they didn't make it to the reporting during the COVID years as well, because these stories would do more harm to the people that we were reporting on, rather than good. And one story I speak about that story on a very surface level, without dropping any names, without dropping any details. It was a story of a family. So if you remember, there were scenes of dead bodies floating in our sacred river Ganga, and it was on Bihar and UP border, and both the states were blaming each other. Bihar was saying, you are sending these dead bodies into our state, into Buxar, and UP was also blaming Bihar, and there was all kind of games being played out by the political parties. But the scenes, and some, of course, some trolls and some people were offended that the images were actually bringing shame to our culture, because if you remember the photos from Prayagraj ghats, they said it is normal in Hindu culture to bury the dead along the river, and it was normal imagery even during the normal times. But it was not the case. And I found out a family. I met them, I visited their home, and I wanted to report on them, but I could figure out that there will be repercussions for them, because Bihar has clearly said anybody who's throwing a dead body in the river, they will be caught, arrested, and they will be charged with this and this section. So I realized that once I publish their details, even if I keep them anonymous, the state is going to find out who they were. So I dropped their story, and they had to throw the body in the Ganga because they didn't have enough money, any resource to cremate the dead bodies. So the only way to say goodbye to that the person who had passed away is to simply offer them to the river Ganga, because it is a sacred river. And this is one of the stories that I didn't do. And similarly, there were other stories as well, but I can't reveal much about them now that enough time has passed, and we don't want to cause any trouble to them.
Jyoti, one more question I wanted to ask you is uh, very few journalists who are very courageous enough, including yourself, were on ground zero during the COVID-19 and reporting when there was so much uncertainty, so much death all around us. And I am also sure you have come across several of your colleagues within the journalistic fraternity who have lost their lives during COVID-19. So, how did you grapple with these fears and at the same time continued with your reportage during COVID-19?
During the first wave, there was we were scared actually. We didn't want to get a virus in some remote village or remote district and be quarantined in schools that we were seeing, and we could not imagine ourselves being quarantined in such centers. So we were really scared. First, we didn't want to catch the virus from anyone, so we were taking extra measures. I was double sanitizing my phone, double triple. I was taking hot shower baths, I was sanitizing my shoes. So there was panic. Clearly there was panic in the first wave, but we didn't want to come back, or we were not fearful in the first wave. But during the second COVID wave, we were not vaccinated. So till May, the young, because I was a young journalist, I was not in the age bracket that the government has had prioritized. So they were prioritizing the healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, and ward boys, and whosoever they considered. But journalists were kept out of that list. Some people, some policymakers, they wrote articles, they advocated that the young population too, the ones who are reporting on COVID, they must be vaccinated. But we ultimately got vaccination on 1st May, and it was a real struggle to get vaccinated, because everybody was trying to get vaccinated in the nearest centers, and they were also traveling miles away to get any vaccination in the any center that they could travel to. So in that case, it made us more vulnerable. First, we were not vaccinated. Secondly, we were going to the COVID wards. I was sometimes wearing a double layer of mask, sometimes triple layer of mask, and even a helmet. In Bihar PMCH, I was wearing a helmet when I was into the COVID wards. But there was a real fear of getting COVID and becoming a number on the statistics list as well. And if you ask me what was the scariest moment, there were quite a few. Firstly, when I developed some symptoms in Lucknow, and I was not able to get myself tested, and then the long wait of the result, which took ideally which would have taken a week to arrive. And there was nobody around me. I was the only guest in the hotel, and if something were to happen to me, who would look after me? But there was a company, my driver, he was so Arnesh ji, he was so warm and helpful. He brought me khichdi and I was able to recover. And I also got my CT scan done in Varanasi because I was so scared. But it came negative. I recovered with some doctors who prescribed me medicines. And the second time it happened, it was in Gazipur. I was in the district hospital. It was an emergency ward, and there were people were crying, women and men. They were lying on the floor, gasping for oxygen. So I was scrolling on Twitter. Actually, I was standing in some corner. I was scrolling on Twitter, and I came across a news that Rohit Sardana, he was a primetime anchor, and he passed away, and he was COVID positive, and he died. At that moment, it really hit me that I could be the next if I don't take precautions, which I was already taking. So I ran out of the emergency ward. My colleague Sajid was also there, and we get into the car. I was sweating, and I I could imagine myself, being in that list of COVID dead. And then we met the CMO, Chief Medical Officer, in the same district, and he said, this is worse than war. Anyone, could be COVID positive. You, me, or anyone sitting in this room. There were some 8 to 10, or I don't remember the number exactly, but there were a handful number of people in the room, and he said we could be COVID positive. So that day I was actually very scared. But apart from these two isolated incidents, I was very determined to cover the crisis, and I never wanted to come back and return, and to return to Delhi to save space and not cover the story till the end. I returned to Delhi in June. By that time, number of COVID cases and COVID deaths had started showing a decrease, and the situation was in control. It looked like that it was in control. So I returned to Delhi after that.
Jyoti, your work is a important documentation of what is happening during the COVID-19 era in the rural parts of India. And your work is a real testimony of shoe leather journalism. Now, I wanted to end with this question, which is what is one of the big message or the big takeaway that you want to leave behind with your book? But for me, if you take the biggest takeaway from this book is that I do not think story will be different if there is another wave of crisis like COVID-19, if another wave of health crisis, we are going to have similar stories. Characters might change, but the classes of people who are getting affected, the castes of people who are getting affected severely, the gendered nature of it, the regions that are going to get severely affected will remain the same. And the hope that I had during the COVID-19 era that in the post COVID world, there will be an active civil society movement and there is going to be a shift in the society at large didn't seem to come through. The story remained the same. So, what is your biggest message or biggest takeaway that you would want to leave behind with this work?
As you said, you have rightly said that there are no takeaways, and if something like the COVID were to happen again to us, or there would be another pandemic of another virus, have we learned any lesson? Have we improved our healthcare system? Can we respond to SOS in a way that we look prepared, we feel prepared? I don't think so. Anytime there is crisis, any district, we seem helpless, and we are soon out of gas cylinders, we are soon out of oxygen cylinders, and the collapse of the healthcare system, it unfolds within some time. It doesn't take us much time to fight and show resilience. We are sounding hopeless, but that's the case. And as much as I want to be a hopeful person, but that's the case. And Harshit Srivastava, one of the characters in the book, and he lives in Lucknow, and what happened to his father, he remains skeptical, and this is what he had to say, that if something like COVID is going to happen again, we are not ready yet. And that's what you are saying, and that's what I feel. So I think we are not prepared yet.
Jyoti, thank you so much for your conversation today.
Thank you, Rishwan. Thank you so much.